I'd rode into Broken Spur on a Tuesday in August with a folded warrant in my breast pocket and a horse that needed new shoes. The plan was simple enough: serve the paper on a cattle broker named Fenwick, wait for the circuit judge, and be gone before the cottonwoods turned. 15 years of that kind of plan. 15 years of towns that looked the same by the time I left them as they did when I rode in. I pinned my temporary badge at the jailhouse, paid a week's board at the hotel, and walked to the Mercantile for a tin of coffee and a look at the town. That was where I first saw her. She was standing at the counter with a swatch of blue wool in her hand, waiting. The clerk was deep in conversation with a rancher's wife about some church social, and the woman with the blue wool just stood there, patient and straight-backed, like she'd learned a long time ago that waiting was the tax on being overlooked. She wasn't young in the way that draws a room's eye without trying, but she had a kind of stillness to her that I noticed the way you notice good weather, quietly, and then all at once. The clerk finally turned to her. "Mrs. Hatch," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, not unkind, but dismissive, the way you'd address a fence post. "The broadcloth you ordered hasn't come in." She nodded once. "I'll check back Thursday." She set the blue swatch on the counter, gathered her basket, and walked out the door past me without a glance. I bought my coffee and walked out after her, and I told myself I was only going to the telegraph office. Her name was Nora Hatch. I learned that much from the hotel keeper that evening without asking directly. I mentioned I'd seen a woman at the Mercantile, composed, dark-haired, and he filled in the rest the way people do when a stranger asks about a neighbor they've half forgotten. Widowed 2 years back. Her husband, a dry goodsman named Hatch, had left her the small house on Birch Street and a sewing trade that kept her fed if she was careful. No children. No family in the territory. She did fine work, the hotel keeper said, in the tone a man uses for something he finds adequate but unremarkable. Fine work. I lay awake that night listening to the August crickets and thought about how a whole life could be compressed into 2 words like that, and how the woman who'd stood at the counter had seemed to carry herself like she knew exactly what the town thought of her and had decided it was their limitation, not hers. I didn't think about her again. That's what I told myself the next morning when I walked past Birch Street on my way to the telegraph office. And the morning after that. The wheel of her supply wagon caught in the rut outside the feed store on a Friday. I was crossing the street and I saw it before she did, the left rear wheel dropping, the wagon listing, a bolt of burgundy cloth threatening to slide off the back. I caught the bolt with one hand and had my shoulder under the axle before she'd climbed down from the seat. "You don't need to," she started. "Wheel's seated wrong," I said. "If you've got a spare pin in that toolbox, I can set it." She looked at me for a moment, really looked, in a way most people in Broken Spur hadn't bothered to do since I'd arrived. "There's a pin," she said. We fixed the wheel together, her holding the axle block while I drove the pin. When it was done she wiped her hands on a cloth she kept in her apron pocket and said, "Thank you, Sheriff." Not effusively. Just the 2 words, and they felt like the honest weight of 2 words rather than the counterfeit weight of 10. I handed her the bolt of burgundy cloth. "Good color," I said, because it was. She took it and something shifted briefly in her expression, not a smile exactly, but a recognition. Like she'd expected a different kind of remark and was caught slightly off guard by a plain one. I walked on. I told myself I walked on without looking back. That's the version I kept for about a week. The town meeting was a Thursday affair, held in the back room of the Cattleman's Hall, and I attended because the circuit judge's letter had arrived and I had news about the Fenwick matter. I didn't expect to stay past my own business. Nora Hatch was there near the back, and I gathered from the agenda that she'd filed a complaint about the drainage ditch the new tannery was running across the rear of her property, fouling her well water. It was a reasonable complaint. I read it in about 4 seconds when I looked at the agenda sheet. The council chairman read through the items and when he got to hers he summarized it in 2 sentences and moved on. Didn't call on her. Didn't ask if she wanted to speak. The tannery owner, a barrel-chested man named Pruitt with political friends on the council, had already said his piece earlier in the meeting, and apparently that was that. I'd been seated near the door. I don't entirely know what made me speak. Habit, maybe. The same habit that had made me a marshal in the first place, before it wore me down. "Chairman," I said. "Mrs. Hatch filed that complaint properly. She hasn't been given the floor." The room turned. The chairman looked at me the way men look at something that's inconvenienced them. "The matter's been addressed, Sheriff." "It hasn't been heard," I said. "There's a difference." A silence. Then Nora Hatch stood up and stated her case in clear, plain sentences, and anyone paying attention could see she'd prepared it carefully and knew exactly what she was talking about. The counsel didn't reverse themselves that night, men like that rarely do in one sitting, but they agreed to a review, which was more than they'd have given her if I'd kept quiet. She didn't look at me when she sat down. She didn't need to. But as the meeting broke up and the room filled with boot scraping and chair dragging, she passed close enough to say quietly, "You didn't have to do that." "No," I said. "I know." She walked out into the evening and I stood there another minute before I followed, and somewhere between the hall and the street I acknowledged to myself that my departure date had stopped feeling like a certainty. My sleeve tore on a nail head at the jailhouse door, not badly, but enough that I couldn't wear the shirt without fixing it. I'd been mending my own clothes for 15 years, adequately if not prettily, and I'd have done it again except that the hotel keeper's wife mentioned Nora Hatch when I asked if there was a seamstress in town, and I found myself on Birch Street the next morning with the shirt folded under my arm. Her house was small and well kept. She came to the door in her work apron and looked at the shirt and said she could have it done by afternoon. I said there was no rush. "Come in," she said. "I'll look at it now and tell you if it's a clean tear or if there's fraying." I sat in her front room while she examined the shirt at her work table by the window. The room was quiet and ordered, and there was a smell of clean cloth and something faintly herbal, dried lavender on the windowsill. Through the front window I could see the cottonwood at the end of the street just beginning to hint at yellow at the edges of its leaves. She worked quickly, and while she worked she talked, not to fill silence, but because she had things to say and a direct enough nature to say them. She asked me about the circuit court schedule. I told her. She asked about the Fenwick matter without asking directly about it, in the way of someone used to reading what a town knows and doesn't know. I gave her more than I'd given most people, and didn't notice until afterward. By the time she finished the sleeve the afternoon light had come around to the back of the house and we'd been talking for an hour and a half. She handed me the shirt. The mend was so clean you had to know where to look. "What do I owe you?" I said. She named a fair price. I paid it and added $1 and said it was for the coffee she'd made without being asked, and she looked at me with that same expression she'd had at the wagon, slightly caught off guard by the plain thing when she'd expected the polite one. I put my hat on and went to the door, and then I stopped and turned back. "I haven't asked," I said. "How's the well water?" She almost smiled. "Still bad," she said. "But the council wrote a letter to Pruitt, which I understand is an achievement." "It is," I said. "I'll follow up." I meant it. I also knew by then that following up on a drainage ditch complaint was not what was keeping me in Broken Spur, and I wasn't young enough or foolish enough to pretend otherwise to myself. I just hadn't yet found the words or the occasion to be honest about it to her. The Harvest Social was held on the first Saturday of September in the town square, with tables set out and lanterns strung between the posts and the whole valley turned out. I went because the sheriff was expected to be visible at public events, and because Nora Hatch would be there. She was at the edge of the gathering with 2 other women, quieter than the rest, dressed in a dark green that suited her. She'd done something to her hair. I noticed without letting myself stare. The trouble came before the music started. Mildred Pruitt, the tannery owner's wife, a woman with a talent for cruelty delivered as social grace, stopped near Nora with 2 of the rancher's wives and made a remark loud enough for a 10-foot circle to hear. Something about the quality of the stitching on the mayor's wife's dress and how one had to be careful whose hands one trusted with good fabric, and how some people in town were better suited to mending work shirts than anything refined. It was aimed at Nora like a thrown stone, and everybody in earshot knew it. The 2 women with Nora went quiet. Nora herself went very still in the way I'd seen her go still at the mercantile counter, that same patience, that same straight back, that same decision not to show what it cost her. I was across the square. I don't remember walking over. I remember being there. "Mrs. Pruitt," I said, quiet enough that it didn't carry far. "I believe you've made a mistake." She turned with the expression of a woman who'd never had anyone push back. "I beg your pardon." "Mrs. Hatch," I said, "mended the mayor's dress coat last spring and the county commissioner's curtains in July, and both of them told me her work was the finest they'd had this side of Denver. I mentioned it to the circuit judge last week and he asked me for her name." I looked at her with the look I'd once used on men with drawn weapons. "I'd be careful about the reputation you're building, ma'am. Word travels." None of it was a lie. I had in fact mentioned her to the judge, though not quite in those terms. Close enough. Mildred Pruitt gathered herself and moved on, and the ranchers' wives drifted after her, and the 10-foot circle of people who'd heard it all quietly found other places to be. I turned to Nora. Her composure was intact, it was always intact, but there was something in her eyes I hadn't seen before, or hadn't been close enough to see. "You didn't have to do that," she said. For the second time. "No," I said. "I know." And then, because I'd been running out of reasons to delay, "Would you give me this dance, Mrs. Hatch?" She looked at me for a long moment, the same measuring look, the kind that didn't flatter and didn't dismiss, just took account of what was actually there. "Nora," she said. "Cale," I said. She took my arm. I walked her home when the lanterns were burning low and the music had gone easy and slow. Birch Street was quiet, the cottonwood overhead dropping the first yellow leaves of autumn across the packed dirt. We walked without hurrying, and we talked without filling silence unnecessarily, and by the time we reached her porch we'd covered enough ground between us, not all of it in words, that I knew I wasn't going to be able to pretend the departure date still meant anything. I took off my hat and held it in both hands, which is the closest I've come to being nervous since I was a young man. "I had a plan," I said, "when I rode into this town. 6 weeks, maybe 7. Serve the warrant, wait for the judge, ride on." I looked at her. "I've been finding reasons to stay." She leaned against the porch post with her arms folded, not making it easier, which I respected. "What kind of reasons?" she said. "One kind," I said. The same one, kept presenting itself in different shapes. The cottonwood rustled. Somewhere down the street a horse shifted in its stall. "The well's still bad," she said. "The well's still bad," I agreed. "And the council needs watching. And the circuit judge will be back in the spring." I took a breath. "And I've got no pressing reason to be anywhere else that feels even half as true as standing on this porch." She was quiet for a moment. Then she unfolded her arms and said, "I'll make coffee." That was all. That was everything. I sent a letter to the marshal's office in Cheyenne 2 weeks later, resigning the traveling commission I'd held for 11 years. I kept the broken Spur badge, the town had offered me the permanent post and I'd taken it, which surprised everyone in Broken Spur except, I think, Nora. Mildred Pruitt took her business for a season to a seamstress in the next county. She came back by winter, as Nora had known she would, with a torn hem and nowhere else to go. Nora fixed it without comment, charged fairly, and the matter was closed. That was how Nora Hatch handled most things, with her hands, her steadiness, and a patience that had nothing weak in it. The drainage complaint was resolved in October. I followed up, as I'd said I would. On the first cold morning of November, I brought her coffee instead of the other way around, walking up Birch Street in the early dark with 2 cups wrapped in a cloth, and she opened the door before I knocked, because she'd heard my boots on the boardwalk, and she knew them by then. She stood in the doorway in the gray morning light with a shawl around her shoulders and took the cup with both hands, and I thought about all the towns I'd ridden through in 15 years without anything snagging, without a single thing that made me look back. I'd spent a long time looking past what mattered. Broken Spur had a whole talent for that. But I was the sheriff now, and I was staying, and the woman in the doorway was the reason, the whole reason, the only reason, dressed up in different shapes until I stopped pretending I didn't see it. She took a sip of the coffee and looked at me over the rim of the cup. "You're not going anywhere," she said. Not a question. "No," I said. "I'm not going anywhere." The morning came up slow and gold over the high plains, and that was enough. That was more than enough.